more kids all day in ways that they don't currently. So their work is really exciting. It's really part of what we're about to know, and it's so fabulous. Let me tell you a little bit about Bill. He is a senior staff. He left Mills and went on to become a high school teacher, which he did for about 10 or 11 years at Berkeley, and had a very exciting career as a teacher. And probably has taught a number of you in this room, whether he's talking directly or indirectly to the teachers that he's also prepared. He's now teaching at University of San Francisco and at Mills, and so we're holding on to Rick with a vengeance. I want to just tell one personal story about Bill and Rick. And when I had met Bill at a number of, we seem to end up in the same room at professional conferences.
Which room that is.
We won't go into his application at Mills. I mean, he had done all kinds of political work around in the Bay Area and elsewhere in Michigan. He had been a chef, which is in a way a political act in my mind, and an exciting one anyway. So he had done all kinds of things, and when it got to, so I read through it, I was excited about what I was seeing there, and excited about thinking of him coming into the program, and I got to reading the letters of reference, and I was going through them, and there was one that was really beautifully written, and you read a lot of these letters of reference, so they pretty much sound, for people who you want to have in the program, they sort of highlight the same kinds of things, but this one was really a beautiful letter, and it says, I can remember at the end, it said something like, I can't imagine anyone who would be better, smarter, more compassionate, more thoughtful person to enter teaching than Rick. He's exactly the kind of person we want to have in the classroom working with kids. He's a great person who will make a great contribution. I should know he's my brother. So we are really honored to have Rick and Bill be part of our community and to be here to talk with us and to share their thoughts and talk about this new exciting book that they've done. There are no two people I can imagine better suited to be speaking here. I know because they are my colleagues.
Thank you, Ingrid. It's a great privilege for us to be here and an honor. And we're going to, we've been vowing to each other for the last couple of weeks that we're going to be brief. And that's very difficult for us because we have an ongoing conversation that seems to never end. And as my son Malik said, who also is a Mills graduate, Malik heard me speak when he was about 5 years old with a group of teachers. And after I was done, he said it was pretty good, but that I went on a little long. And then he asked if teachers get paid by, if professors get paid by the word. It's piecework, and that's why we can't shut up. But we have vowed to be quiet. If we violate that, or if we get too quiet, then our brother John is in the back and he can speak as he's part of this also. We've decided to do this as a conversation, as a dialogue. And it's a dialogue with 6 brief utterances. I hope they're brief, going back and forth. And then we're going to open it up to you. So we want you to be engaged, attentive, planning to jump into the next utterance. I want to shout out to Mills for a couple of reasons. One is that we are really honored to be in this series with Gloria Ladson-Billings and Claude Steele and Sonia Nieto. These are people who've influenced us a great deal. But also very, very thrilled that Mills College has taken on something as complicated as a conversation about race that they intend to be an ongoing conversation for all of you. The title of the series is straightforward to the point of bluntness. Preparing educators and youth in a racist world. I would have been in the back of the meeting saying, couldn't we tone that down? But why should it's the way you are. And let's just have it straight up and let's have that conversation. And really the whole notion of the taboo begins right there, because this is a conversation that's difficult to have. It's difficult to have across race, but it's difficult to even mention. It's a taboo. It's one of those things we don't like to talk about. I was re-looking at James Baldwin's marvelous essay, The Fire Next Time, in which it begins with a letter to his nephew, where he indicts the United States. And then he says, after a kind of a very severe indictment of the United States, he says, that there is a remedy, and the remedy is painful and complex but available. White Americans must look unblinkingly at history, face our constructed and cushioned reality, confront the tears of the wounded, the consequences of our wickedness. We must harness ourselves then to a great collective effort toward justice. Baldwin finds hope in an image of, quote, the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of the others in order to end the racial nightmare and achieve our country. And what he says is the real crime is not everything he'd indicted the country for in the history. The crime is the claim of innocence, the claim that we didn't know, that we didn't understand. And that's the taboo. The taboo is facing that reality. So again, we salute Mills for opening this up and for reminding us that we live in the United States of amnesia, and if that's the US of A, and that if we're going to make any progress, we have to face forward. Rick and I intend to have a dialogue, and then, as I say, open it up to you. But the spirit of dialogue is always to speak with the possibility of being heard, and at the same time to listen with the possibility of being changed. And that means it's the most subversive of the pedagogical gestures, the gesture of dialogue, because there's gaps, there's misunderstandings, there's bound to be hurt feelings, there's bound to be things that aren't said and uncomfortable silences, but that all goes with the dialogical territory. Anna said that I went to Bank Street and Rick went to Mills, and then I went over to Teachers College, as Anna said, and I wanted just to say that when I was at Bank Street, I was a graduate student at Bank Street, and when I came to the end of the program, I didn't want to leave, and I think a lot of Mills people feel that way. Like, why would I leave? I want to stay here in the warm embrace of this joint. And I was with another group of students, we began to explore the possibility of Bank Street creating a doctoral program. And we couldn't succeed, we didn't succeed, and my professors at Bank Street urged me to go over to Teachers College. At Teachers College, they have a giant, you don't know this, but Teachers College is just down the street from Bank Street. They have a big chapel, and it's a chapel where John Dewey used to lecture. So there's a statue of John Dewey there. And slowly I realized, and we began to develop a joke among the students, that at Teachers College they have a chapel, but Bank Street is a chapel. And that we said that with both the most loving and also a little bit of edge of criticism. You know, if we're too much of a chapel, we have to kind of break out of that. So it's in the spirit of honoring and loving Bank Street and Mills that we begin this conversation. So as I said, this is a conversation that begins with 6 brief utterances in a necessary conversation. The utterances are these. Number 1, the white man's burden. Number 2, the principle of equality. 3, the public space. 4, the alchemy of race and science. 5, mind the gap. And 6, occupy the future. So we're going to do that very quickly, and then please be prepared to jump in. Rick.
All right. So, the white man's burden. I get to start with the white man's burden. And I will say, I felt honored and humbled and even a little embarrassed to be in this series with such important scholars of color in this country. And like, why the white guys? And why would we be here as some kind of experts on racism? But actually, it dawned on me that the converse is true, that since race is a white invention, it's not that we're some kind of exceptions or good white people who have transcended it. But since it is a white invention, it, in a sense, is our obligation, responsibility, it's something we can contribute to talk about it. Watching the Republican campaign recently particularly showed us how its ongoing narrative of race and really covert and overt invoking of racism in the electorate that is a big part of our national culture. And so it's been disturbing for many people to see. It's been funny on Jon Stewart, but it's been actually disturbing to see how powerful that narrative is. So in a sense, we know that race, of course, does not have a scientific basis. You don't find race anymore in biology class being discussed. Race is a social construction, and by that I mean it's something that's created by people for social purposes, and but it is a fiction, but it is also a very hard fact of our culture. So we have to get a handle on that, and we'll start with a little thinking about what race is. I would assert that race was essentially invented to oppress. It was set up with colonialism, with the conquest of non-European peoples by force and violence, and it was set up to reinforce the power relationships that were created. So, in a sense, being white was a very American thing. Even in Europe, Europeans who got on the boat would think of themselves as Italian or Irish or Jewish. It was only by getting here that they came to learn that you're white. And actually, the strange race kind of hierarchies of our country operate in other ways. People who come from the Philippines or Vietnam or China never really saw themselves as Asian, which is this other American uber category. But this is something that you have to learn in the United States. So in a sense, we have sort of this ongoing story, this ongoing narrative, and it's an ongoing social force that's as W.E.B. Du Bois has said, is holding back and is key to the progress of democracy in the United States. And this race narrative and race reality has an iteration in every generation, whether it was the slave trade, slavery, the Jim Crow laws, and I would say now it takes the form of poverty, prisons, and drug wars, but it's still freighted with all the code words of the same racial hierarchy. The other thing that would be worth thinking about is what's behind the sort of frantic white panic around race. We see it in Arizona in the campaign against immigration. We see it in the voter suppression projects that are happening across the country, not only with people who come out of prison, but all kinds of new kind of poll tax and poll test type of activities in voting. And this voter suppression is really tied to a fear, a terrible fear, that white people have of being outnumbered. And sometimes I think it's a fear that we have that they're going to do to us just a little of what we did to them when they finally become the majority. And actually, I think oppressed people tend to be much more generous when they take power. But this is what we're living with, and in a sense, we're living with this weird reality of the victim narrative. The richest, most privileged people in the world, which is white Americans, still manage to shake their head and feel like we're a victim. Everyone's hurting us, and everything's hard for us. And so it's a hard narrative to maintain, but it's something that's powerfully taken hold in the imagination of white America. But basically I want us to think about if we want to live a life against white supremacy and we're in education, it's not just a matter of learning tolerance, it's a matter of transforming ourselves. And we have to ask ourselves, are our schools preparing for us to live in a world, one where we have caring relations between people and we have a rich, diverse culture? Or are they preparing us to live in two nations, one hopeless and dangerous, one fearful and behind-gated communities? This is what's at stake in our education project today.
Okay, the principle of equality. In a country founded on the secular belief that we are all equal, with all the flaws of that founding moment, we spend an inordinate amount of time finding scientific bases for inequality, right? We spend a lot of time trying to figure out the ways in which we're not equal when we found it, the nation is aspirationally at least founded on this principle. No one believes that the founding fathers thought that there weren't differences between people. Everyone in here is different, but there was a principle at work, and the principle was, the principle is that we are all the same. That is, we are all human, but we're the same in such a way that we're each different. And that's a complicated idea to hold on to. We're all the same, and we're each different. And both have to be true, held in our heads at all times. Equality was a self-evident truth. Now, slavery was built into it. Women's lack of participation was built into it. But this is the aspiration that around which social struggles have worked their way out for the last 200 years. So there's a social principle at work here. And the social principle is there's no objective grounds for selecting ideals that are important. So we simply say, in this or that area, our differences are not important. So take human strength. You know, it's just not something we take as important in our social. We are all human, those of you who are strong, and the rest of us too. Or body type, or a lot of other things. And it even goes to the question of things like IQ and so-called intelligence. It's a known fact that people over 60 lose their intellectual capacity at an incredible rate. Witness. And yet nobody says we're not part of the community. We are part of the community. In fact, we're a valued part of the community, at least theoretically most of the time. And so those differences we decide as a political choice don't matter. And yet the difference of race has mattered, and it has mattered mightily to the point where we, now that we're in a so-called post-racial society, which I'll talk about in a minute, but race has mattered so that for 2/3 of the time that African Americans have been on this continent, for 2/3 of that time, they were an enslaved people. For another 100 years, they were subject to, a form of apartheid. And even when political equality happened, there's still the ghetto looms and the prison looms, the gulag looms. And so we are still in a struggle to understand and make sense of the political ideal of equality. Now that we live in a post-racial society, so-called, we have to come to terms with something I think very complicated, especially for educators who've been involved in the kind of multicultural movement. And that is that multiculturalism, as a goal, as an aspiration for several decades, came to an end on November 4th, 2008. In other words, people have been pushing to get into the highest levels of government, corporations, law, the arts, athletics, everything. And that has been a struggle, a righteous struggle for decades. And then on November 4th, 2008, the highest office in the land was occupied by an African American. And in a way, that means that the kind of struggle for access at the highest levels has come to a kind of an abrupt halt. Or another way of saying it is, it's the Noah's Ark vision of multiculturalism. 2 of everyone, and the rest of y'all can drown.
So I'm going to take another chapter and call it the public space. So one way to think about moving towards action is basically reframing the question. So often I think that while we're trying to improve and be transformative in education, we accept too much the terms and the game as defined by those in power. And then when we try to create success within that game, we've already conceded too much. I know that many of you have seen the debate around Waiting for Superman. So Waiting for Superman was this film, this documentary, which really, in a very articulate way, gave the strongest argument to the kind of neoliberal, all-competition view that is driving really our Department of Education, including that bad teachers are the problem and we need to get the teachers unions so we can look at bad teachers out. Which, by the way, I would say, while all of us have seen some bad teachers that do need to be dealt with, fact that 40% of young people who go into teaching quit in the first 3 years is a much bigger problem and one that no one is addressing. But anyway, in our talkback against the ideas of waiting for Superman, many of us point out that the entire context that students are coming from in terms of poverty, health care, social supports, violence and safety are not considered in this, in the kind of education proposals of NCLB and Race to the Top. And so we find ourselves arguing all the time that these things have to be taken into account. We have to support anti-poverty and social transformation efforts. I agree with that, but I also would say that one of the problems with the way we who are trying to be on the side of the kids frame that is it becomes a new kind of liberal progressive view of the culture of poverty and the idea that those kids always have problems and we don't, and that argument does not recognize the resilience, the strength, and the brilliance of so many of our kids who come from urban communities. So we have to kind of think about what we have to go to the curriculum. Like, what are we teaching, and are we thinking deeply enough about what to teach and how to teach? Because in many ways, we've sort of accepted this sort of neoliberal idea that each individual is an individual fighting for himself or herself, and our job as teachers is to elevate, and we're so self-congratulatory, elevate and save one kid and get them the college scholarship, and then later we say, that was fabulous, I did that, and maybe we can go to scale and save everyone. But it's an idea that has contempt for the communities that kids come from and does not take responsibility for a really transformative project that would deal with the way these young people need and want to transform their community. In many ways, you could say, even if we did in East Oakland, where there's 75% unemployment for African-American males, even if we did in East Oakland succeed and get all these kids good SAT scores, get all these kids strong in what we call academic English, what would happen? Would they get into college? Are there places in college? Would they have success, or would there be some other way failure would be defined? When I was saying that to my son Max, he immediately quoted back this line from the Coup, which we should learn from, Boots Riley. If everybody in the hood had a PhD, you'd say that, doctor, flip that burger hella good for me. So I think that kind of speaks to this. So in a certain way, it's important for us to understand better and honor better the literacy practices and the strengths of students that we work with, and in some ways recognize the ways that they speak with their own voice in Life and Death Matters, the way they do it in slams, radio work, graffiti, turf fiend dancing. And our job is not just to try to co-opt these efforts to bring children back to the traditional curriculum. Our challenge is to transform the curriculum. I think of places like Albany Park Theater Project in Chicago, or Youth Radio here in Oakland, where students are running out of school to spend long hours doing hard work in these sites. And they're not getting credit, and they're not getting grades, and they're not getting anything but the ability to speak their truth and have their voice and begin to work out with each other how they're going to transform this world, which has been so hostile to them in every institutional way.
So, the alchemy of race and science. This goes back to the beginning. Rick talked about all the ways that science has tried to divide up the races. 173 in one category, 150 years ago, and 79 in another. And I think about Chicago, where 100 years ago, crime statistics were reported as Irish, Jewish, Italian, Black, and Mexican.
Oh, yeah.
Really? And then white, you know, but those, and we all find, that seems strange, right? Except that was a common sense of then, and our common sense now makes about as much sense. The whole experience of slavery was in part an experience of an attempt to destroy the family, and the family became reduced to a reproductive unit, an economic unit. And then progressivism came along, and eugenics came right with it. And then the struggle was to not allow black people to reproduce. And it's been that kind of same, it's the same kind of idiot science and kind of measuring of skulls that you see in a book like Beloved, and in the reality of the whole progressive movement, and even in the founding of the birth control efforts, Margaret Sanger and others. So this is a long and tragic history that we have to come to terms with. Some of you might have seen this morning's New York Times. I just have to point to an article called "Far from the Capitol, the Race to the Top is an Unhappy Slog." And I'll just read you a couple of sentences from the opening sentence. Even if you think the Obama administration's signature education program, Race to the Top, will not help a single child in America learn, you have to admire its bureaucratic magnificence. And you know, he talks about it's had a major effect while costing the administration nothing. Then he says this: second, the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and his education scientists will not have to do any of the dirty work. I kind of like that contemptuous term, the education scientists. And what he talks about in the article is a way in which the Race to the Top has the kind of bureaucratic magnificence of being both very powerfully impactful, but not having to take any of the cost to themselves. So all the jobs are pushed to the to the base. In Long Island, the story really focuses around a Long Island administrator who's trying to figure out how you evaluate band teachers, people who teach band. How do you get them involved in this? Because what's the objective science in it? And it reminds me a lot of the efforts over the years in testing to justify what is unjustifiable. That is to say, we reified difference, even though we're supposed to be operating in the spirit of equality, but we end up, instead of saying, you've got to go to that segregated school and you're going to have a crummy curriculum, we say, hey, you took the test, you did poorly on it, and so you own your own failure, right? But a lot of it reminds me of the recent expose of the U.S. News and World Report figures. I don't know, some of you might have read about this, but U.S. News and World Report ranks universities, right, and ranks programs and ranks colleges. And one of the things that Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote about this, discovered is that he discovered a lot of things, but one is that the variables that they use are so crazy that, you know, if you tinker with one of them, everything shifts. An example. This is from this same article from this morning. In New York, which is this about New York, in New York, teacher evaluations were going to be based, 20% of a teacher's evaluation were going to be based on kids' test scores. And then out of the blue, a year later, May 2011, Governor Cuomo decided it would be 40% of the evaluation would be kids' test scores. Now, anyone who knows anything about schools knows the falseness and the faultiness of that. And it reminded me immediately of Gladwell's article where, for example, law schools are ranked. And 30% of the ranking of law schools is reputational. That is, what do other law school faculty think of this thing? So someone did a study, and they put 10 schools in a list, and they asked 450 law professors to rank them. One of the schools on the list was, I think, it wasn't Penn State, but it was like Penn State. And it was a school that didn't have a law school. And it always was ranked 5th. How can it get that ranked 5th? Because it was Penn State, you know, a place that kind of is in the middle. It's not Harvard, but it's, you know, not something else. So, but that's the kind of phoniness that we buy into. And what I worry about, and I think people at Mills are the kind of people, and people who are part of this larger community, are the kind of people who have to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes. we have to point not just to, kind of in an abstract way to the ways that this does a disservice, especially to the kids who are on the bottom, who are on the bottom in terms of access and equity, but it does a disservice to the whole educational project and perverts it badly. This reliance on tests and this kind of default position that we have to kind of go to the test and see, what that tells us about how kids are doing. It's not just a faulty measure, it doesn't make any sense in its own face. So we have to kind of challenge this in, I think, a much deeper way than we've been willing to, and say this isn't the measure either of a good teacher or a good school or a successful student. And we have to find other ways, and we can talk about this at length, we have to find other ways to say this is what good teaching looks like, this is what we need to invest in. And then we have to get over the idea that these test scores not only are a proxy for intelligence, but that they kind of get everybody off the hook in terms of the other things that need to happen. So I saw a kid in Chicago in the 4th grade a year ago who missed 40 days of school because of chronic asthma and no health care. And you're going to judge that teacher based on a test when we already know what the outcome is. So the test tests something, but what is it they test? Oh, it just popped into my head another thing about the law schools. My wife is a law school professor, and in her law school, the law school gives corporations in Chicago lots of money to hire their students as interns. And then, when the question is, how many of your graduates are working, it's way up at 99% because the school granted them money to hire the kids who couldn't get hired elsewhere. That's just as phony as it can possibly be, and it's endemic in the thing. It also tells us why I predict that next week we will see another cheating scandal somewhere in America. Why? Because it's all incentivized. You'd be an idiot not to cheat. And the cheating goes on. So we're now discovering that Michelle Reed cheated in Washington, D.C. But you'd be an idiot not to cheat. That's what everything is based on. So we've got the wrong things going in all directions in the testing. And I think we have to stand up and be heard and say this is not the right way to go. There are other ways to go, and investing in education, investing in teaching is much more to the point than trying to figure out, who ranks where. So they test something, but what do they test? There's been a lot of research that shows that the greatest predictor of how you do on any standardized test is the income level and educational level of your parents. So it'd be a lot less expensive just to ask kids that question. And then that would be the end of it. And we'd be 90% right. So that just kind of misses the whole point. And then when I see things like our mayor in Chicago, talking endlessly about test scores, and then developing an initiative that again was in the New York Times about more time in the day, that Rahm Emanuel was pushing the idea that these poor urban schools will do better if they have another hour of instruction in the day. And his kids go to the University of Chicago Lab School where they have less time in the day. But never mind, let's not look at that. But the amount of kind of capital that he gets on that, the ways in which the whole city begins to kind of drink the Kool-Aid and act like this is sensible. The Sun-Times reported the state test scores, and the title, the caption, the headline on the article was, "Time in the day makes a difference." And then they showed you the best schools. Lake Forest, Glencoe, Winnetka, all the Tony North Shore schools did better, and they had longer days. So that becomes a causal claim, but they didn't say, and they're rich, white, isolated schools, and they didn't also point out that Chicago schools have been out of compliance in phys ed, have no art and music, have no hour long for lunch, all the things that Glencoe and Winnetka and Evanston have. So there's a fraudulent thing going on here, and if we're not willing to call it what it is, then I think we trap ourselves at the back end into something unconscionable for ourselves and our kids.
This is my third chapter, our fifth, let's say. It's called Mind the Gap, a few words about the achievement gap. Now, of course we understand it's always your job to work on the gatekeepers. We want to do the real work And in many ways, I feel like sometimes in my teaching, when I see former students, we get together to talk about how great things were, what happened. Anything that was good and important was never measured in a test. It was always something that was off. That was the B game. So in one way, we're kind of arguing to sort of hold up the B game as more important. But we understand the gatekeepers and that it's our responsibility to help kids as much as we can with the gatekeepers. But in a certain way, it was weird. When I left classroom teaching, I went to Cal to get a PhD, and I thought, wow, I'm going to Cal. This is where the gates are built. The gatekeepers are here, and the office of the president and so on. And you know, because these hurdles the kids have to go through, they're really not made by God. They're just made by people. So I thought those people were at Cal. Or at Sacramento. But really, everyone there was just like, oh, this is what we got to do. This is what we got to do. This is what it is. And there was no sense that this was a social construction. So in a sense, even as you work on the gatekeepers in a certain way, I feel like it's our responsibility so that we don't go insane, so we don't live in cognitive dissonance and sort of live a lie that we kind of know is a lie, just as the kids know it's a lie, as we tell them these things about, well, you know, do your math and you'll get a BMW when you're 35. It would be to tell the truth. So there's a couple of lies I'd like to speak to, or a couple of myths. One is this idea that we're in constant competition. That the reason our kids have to do better is that, after all, we're in a war with China and India. It's an economic war. And we must kick their ass or they're going to kick our ass. And it's really part of this sort of neoliberal idea that everything is competition. And actually, I know Chinese people, I know Indian people, and I don't have anything against them. You know, the line is almost like, keep them in the sweatshops so we can keep a high standard of living. And I think a more equitable distribution of wealth in the world would be a good thing. So when did I, as a teacher, sign up for this war? Or when did this 4th grade girl become a soldier in this war? So that's something that at least we should question it. At least when we go out to the Pacific Brewery and have a beer, we should just say, we're not for this war. You know? We're conscientious objectors. The idea that we're helping kids into jobs, you know, and this whole struggle about they need a job, they need a job. They do need a job, but they don't need a job building drones. They don't need a job doing things that destroy the planet. So we could say there are many things that students, that our communities need, that is work. There is a lot of work to be done. There are closed hospitals to be reoccupied. There are houses to be built. There is food to be grown. That's work. But just going for a job presupposes that you want those in power to create these jobs, and anything, and that we must constantly have an expanding economy. You know, it doesn't make any sense. The only thing in nature that expands endlessly is our cancer. And we don't want an economy that's a cancer on the earth. So actually, Jimmy Carter said this, got thrown out of office, but we need an economy that slows down and gets smaller. So that's an important thing. But speaking a few words on the gap. All of us are concerned about the achievement gap, and many reformers and KIPP schools and the Texas Miracle, all these people claim that they're going to narrow the gap. And of course, Gloria Ladson-Billings says it's not a gap, it's an educational debt. It's a housing debt. It's a healthcare debt. It's an opportunity debt. So we could talk about it that way. But I think that in a certain way, the gap is something that it's unbelievably difficult to solve. We could get to the moon. We can't figure out this gap. We have 16,000 PhDs and grad students who go to AERA. Almost all of them are writing papers that have something to do with closing the gap. And imagine if the achievement gap were gone, they'd all be out of work. Because it's like what we do. So in a sense, I'd like to rethink the gap. In a sense, when we call it a gap without talking about the social context, we're isolating it in the student, and we're putting the blame on the student and saying all the work has to be done on the student, not in the broader society. So what we really have to do is critique the terms of the discussion about the gap. The gap rhetoric contains assumptions about the solution within the very way the problem is framed. In other words, the solution is to make everyone be like me, white middle class Rick. So it's the way the problem is framed. There comes a time when we have to reject the problem statement, not really solve the achievement gap, just turn away from it.
Finally, occupy everything. Occupy this, occupy that, occupy everything. Many of us have been captured by the, our imaginations have been captured by the Occupy movement, and many of us understand that Occupy is not a destination, but rather an opening. It's not a point of arrival, it's an invitation. And one of the things I'm loving right now in Chicago is that, I've been to 12 Occupy sites, and they're all different. Chicago is not just an intersection. It's not, whereas Detroit, it's like a shanty town, and Boston, it's like a library. It's like, everything is different. But what's brilliant is that, 6 months ago, before any of this happened, no one was talking about income inequality or, what's going on in that regard. And now, nobody can stop talking about it. It's become a big feature in the presidential race and so on. So I think that we owe a huge debt. And in Chicago, what's happened is that even though it's been shut down, kind of, everybody who's in motion is using Occupy as the kind of handle about what they're doing. So as we speak, Sarah Paretsky, the great mystery writer, is occupying the public library in her neighborhood, which has been shuttered by the mayor. She's doing a read-in in front of the library, Occupy the libraries. The teachers union and the parents who are opposed to the shutting down of the schools are occupying the Board of Education. Last week, the superintendent walked out because the occupiers were too noisy, and when they quieted down, the superintendent of schools said, I hope that, the head of the Board of Education said, I hope you've gotten that out of your system. And they all went crazy. But the point is that there's something very refreshing about what's happening in terms of people naming the obstacles to their own humanity, their own freedom, their own sense of justice, and then acting on it. This is very much in the spirit of teaching the taboo, and what teachers, I think, have a fundamental responsibility to do. I think teaching in the spirit of social justice is teaching that doesn't just fight for equity and access, but is teaching that fights for the recognition of every human being. And it's teaching that fights for the idea that the world as such is something that we have to both understand and recognize and get smarter about. But the world as such is standing right next to the world as it could be and as it should be. And you can't be an informed, active, resident, citizen, participant, activist if you can't see that next to what is what could be or what should be. And that's part of our responsibility. So teaching the taboo is always, for us, a matter of asking the next question, developing a curriculum of questioning. The historical example that draws me always is the example of the Freedom Schools in Mississippi in 1963. That came out of a moment when the movement was in a downward direction. And the mythology of the civil rights movement is some kind of heroic narrative arc that always went this way, but it's not true. There were gaps and problems always, and many things to talk about that. But in 1963, Charlie Cobb, a volunteer from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, proposed Freedom Schools in a little mimeograph proposal that was 2 pages long. And he said, the black people of Mississippi have been denied many things. They've been denied, forward-looking curriculum, fully trained teachers, decent facilities. But the fundamental injury is they've been denied the right to think for themselves about the circumstances of their lives and how they might be otherwise. That's a revolutionary sentence if you think about it. They've been denied the right to think for themselves about how I got here, what's my story, and where do I want to go. And in Mississippi in 1963, you can believe that that created a hailstorm of reaction, and including the 3 martyrs of Mississippi were freedom school teachers who were murdered, lynched, kidnapped, lynched, murdered, for the crime of investigating an arson of a freedom school, for the crime of being freedom school teachers. But the freedom school curriculum, which you can find online, written in, it's called the Mississippi Freedom School Curriculum 1964, is nothing but questions. Who are we? Why are we in the freedom movement? What do we hope to accomplish? What does the majority culture have that we want? What do we have that we want to preserve? Those kinds of questions are as relevant on the west side of Chicago or in Oakland today as they were in Mississippi in 1963. Those are the kinds of questions that drive you forward, that let you see that you have agency in your life, that let you see that the fullness of your humanness is not fully expressed and must be fully expressed. Or as Patrick Connaughton, who's right there, said recently at a conference that I was at, you need to teach kids you don't need permission to interrogate the world. That's the taboo. You don't need permission to interrogate the world. So I think of these things all day. They always are popping into my head. And the one that I like the most, because I thought it up, was when Governor Huckabee was the governor of Arkansas. You may know that he was a very large man. He lost a dramatic amount of weight. And he became an advocate against childhood obesity and all that. Good stuff. But you may not know that in Arkansas, they have on the report card, right next to your math, English, and social studies grade, they have your body mass index listed. So you get an A in English, a B in math, and you're fat. That's what you get. And I want to say, interrogate that. What's the state of physical education in your school? Who owns the franchise to the lunchroom and the snack bar? What are the parks like? On and on and on. Questions. Or even questions like, what's the history of these kinds of reforms making a difference in terms of changing behavior? Those are the kinds of things that smart, informed people are able to do. And those are the kinds of things we can bring to our teaching again and again. After all, in a democracy, even an aspirational, flawed, partially failed democracy, in a democracy, we take as a precious and fragile ideal this notion of equality, that every human being is of incalculable value, every human being, and that our task is then not a task of separating and sorting, but a task of bringing to bear all the resources that we can and fighting for the possibility of everyone being a full participant in the social order. Of course, some of that is policy. Things like the savage inequalities that we see all around us can't be ignored. But just because Arnie Duncan's racing to the top or Rahm Emanuel's fighting for another hour a day in the schools doesn't mean that we should brush aside the real inequalities that are built into the system. We should fight against those kinds of things. But as teachers, as school teachers, we can do other things as well. And that is, we can remember and recognize and understand that our job is not to teach obedience and conformity. Our job is to teach initiative, agency, and courage, imagination, the possibility of building your own life and taking control of it. So we should, with our students, we should pay less attention to the idiotic debates that are going on in the political realm and much more attention to what's going on in the ground in terms of creating the kinds of efforts, the kinds of movements that can really transform society from the bottom up. Okay, thank you. Now it's your turn. Give a speech. It's awkward. Yeah, go ahead. We have to be provocative. First question's from our sister-in-law, so to set up another retired teacher.
Specific,
Say it loud,
can you give an example of some ways that the assessment or measurement of success
You mean it would be better?
That's
a better way.
Right. What kinds of things can be done?
Well, actually, Linda Darling Hammond has written a lot about this, and she was, in fact, Obama's advisor when he ran, but got shunned to the side. That she makes a big argument that there are a lot of ways to measure, and some of the stuff that EA has to do. There's a lot of what's EA? Envision Academy. We have some Envision that worked on. A lot of it would have to do with perhaps portfolios, performances, narrative evaluations, all kinds of community and peer evaluations. And one thing she points out in that is that those are difficult to do. And since they're difficult to do, no one wants to do them. They're difficult to do, but important things are often difficult to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of people want to do it. I don't think
the measurement that you want a number is the problem. And I argue often that too many MBAs kind of went into policy. Nothing against people who have MBAs, but and MBAs want a metric. They want a number, right? You've got to have a number so you can compare this to that. So this is where the test scores came in. Well, they're not really great, but they approximate something. And so then the test scores came to dominate. But that's a silly metric. And a silly metric versus a complicated, big metric is all the difference in the world. And Max, another thing Max pointed out to me was, in Moneyball, if you ever saw Moneyball, about how the Oakland A's took a low-budget team and made them succeed. They used metrics too. They used all the sabermetrics, all these numbers, but they did the opposite. They didn't take one number. In fact, the old line of how you find a good hitter is someone with a good batting average or RBI. And what they did was find 15 other things to measure. It could be slugging percentage, on-base percentage, all kinds of things that contribute to a team doing well. So good metrics are complex and hard to come up with. Lazy metrics are, let's just take one number and then just rank them, and that's what's very destructive.
Well, the tragedy of that one number is that it's so predictable how it's going to come out, but you own the result. You took the test, you did badly, etc. The thing is that you said people don't want to do it, but what you meant, I think, was people in power don't find that an easy thing to. Yeah, I think teachers love doing it. I think conscientious teachers would love to have exactly what the Obama kids have and the Rahm Emanuel kids have and the Arnie Duncan kids have, and that is small classes with committed teachers who are unionized, incidentally. The University of Chicago Lab School teachers are unionized. Abundant classrooms, with a curriculum based at least in part on following your own interests and so on. I was just
complex assessment.
Yeah, complex assessment, so that the sense, if you're at the lab school or at Sidwell Friends, the sense is you're not going to fail. But let's talk for a minute about metaphors, because I think a lot of what's going on in the education discussion is a metaphoric way of talking that reduces education in precipitous ways. So when we say all to college, everyone in our school is going to go to college. I think that what college is a metaphor for something, but what? What's it a metaphor for? I think it's a metaphor for many things, but I think all schools who talk that way have a responsibility to unpack that metaphor. So for example, it's a metaphor for having life chances open up. It's a metaphor for having a future worth striving for. It's a metaphor for having lofty goals for yourself and a sense of possibility and a sense of hope about your future. Those are good ideas. But as soon as you reduce it to everyone to college, you've suddenly narrowed it, and certainly what you have in mind is something like Colby College. You don't have in mind, a little green campus where you live in a dorm. That's where something like 5% of American kids' higher education go, to Colby College, $43,000 a year tuition. I know this because I just spoke there. And it turns out the kids in the education program there all went to very fancy high schools, and about 50% of them took test prep on top of it. Gee whiz, and so the inequity of all that is so transparency. What we need to do instead is to push into the idea that assessment, the other thing about this single number is it doesn't loop back and tell the teacher how to teach. All it does is judges you. It doesn't tell you what you're going to do tomorrow that you did that's different. You must have greater commitment. You must work harder. You must be like all these teachers in movies who are ready to jump off a bridge to make sure they have a heart attack. They have your wife run over by a train. You know, I mean, this is crazy talk. You know, what we ought to do is say, when I was at Envision today, one of the really impressive things was one of the senior projects is to do a portfolio. I'm a huge, huge believer and have been for a long time in portfolios. My kids went to a public school in New York. In order to graduate from the high school that they were in the elementary school, you had to put together a portfolio of 15 items. And those 15 items included grades and test scores. Get that off the table. Now we have 13 other things. What would you put in a portfolio that would communicate to kids, this is what it means to be an educated person. This is what an educated person knows and can do. 13 other items, an original art project, a record of community service, a reading autobiography projected 5 years forward, the 4 books that influenced me the most in my 4 years or 5 years in high school, and so on.
Physical challenge.
A physical challenge, which is different for me than it is for any of you. You don't have an arthritic knee, or maybe some of you. But you know, so it's just the point is, this is what adds up to an educated person. So I think, again and again, we see people who can do that and are doing that, and if we let our imaginations go wild, we could get further down that road. But it is going to take a greater commitment of time and money. And that means getting off of the kind of speeding train that says this one metric says it all. I encourage you also to look at things, performance things, like if you haven't seen Louder Than a Bomb, the documentary film out of Chicago, Google it. It's about the teen poetry slam in Chicago. And you want to see kids who are committed in a disciplined way, telling their stories in a way that's absolutely unique, or youth radio, which you all know well. You know, I mean, these are examples of kids committed to projects that pay off in 1,000 ways. Others, we're going to take many, but go ahead, others. Any other family members want to
I don't know if you're familiar with, Rick probably is, with Jerry Brown.
That other people's children should have for their education something we would never allow for our own. I got so angry a year or so ago when I saw a picture on the front page of the Times of a little African-American girl looking into an animal pen. There were some pigs playing in there, and the headline was, trip to the farm may improve test scores. I wanted to jump off of a bridge because I would never say that about my kids. Barack Obama would never say it about his kids, you know. Oh, I'm sorry, Malia and Sasha, no violin lessons or trip to the museum or concert or Hawaii or camping trip unless I can see that it improves your test scores. Would they say that? No, because it's assumed that the privileged want their kids to have full access to the wide range of what this culture and society is about, including the ability to be critical of it, but not other people's kids. Other people's kids can go to the farm if it improves their test scores. It's an outrage, and we should not allow those things to innocently go by without angry responses to the Times and everyone. Yes?
I love your idea of a 15-item portfolio, and I'm brainstorming what mine would be. But I think it's partly easy for me to love that as a classroom teacher or within my school, coming up with what that would look like. One of the issues that comes up with this testing is when you're going from top down, how many days of the year are you going to require of schools?
How
many days of the year are you going to say, you know, as a district or as a state, we're going to take this much time from you as our means of assessment? So what is your guys' reaction in terms of how that works level-wise?
Well, again, you know, I think Grace is here, and I was just observing Grace, a teacher in Fremont, and they were just figured out because of testing and because of these pacing guides that this district has bought into. And where they used to do 4 weeks on Japan for the 7th graders, now they only do 2 weeks because there's going to be more testing on the Middle Ages. You know, and it's really, where are you on Thursday? So we are proposing a critique and a vision. And even as you know, sometimes teachers and schools have banded together and refused to take tests. But that's a very risky thing. We're not demanding people do that all the time. But the critique and vision is at least something to have in mind, even as Grace is stuck in that pacing down as a student teacher, right? So you may be having to give up all this time for assessment. I think all that time for assessment is ridiculous. That kind of assessment especially. But the only thing you can do is be subversive in the interest of the students in every way you can. And that's what I think teachers do that all the time. That's what I was calling kind of the B game.
I'm kind of thinking suddenly about being a parent and raising 3 kids and now having a couple of grandkids. And I'm thinking about a couple of things about that. One is that as a parent, you have to balance. There's this kind of contradiction that you dive into. On the one hand, I don't want them to feel that the test is the be-all and end-all, or that the grade they get in mathematics actually is a reflection of who they are at all. I want to resist that. I want to build them up in a way that says, come on now, let's get that. But at the same time, I don't want to close doors for them. I don't want any doors closed for them. So I remember long conversations with Malik, who's now a tenured teacher here in the Bay Area, where I would have to try to persuade him by saying, but you get to play baseball, to go to high school, please go to high school. But not because high school, and then I'm suddenly remember my youngest son, when he was kicked out of 1st grade, and and I had to go pick him up, and we got in the car, and it turned out he had called the gym teacher. He had cursed at the gym teacher, called him a name. And we got in the car, and he explained to me what had happened. I said, what happened? He was really angry. And he said, we had to wear these ropes around our neck with our names. And I was very uncomfortable. This kid was special ed in a million ways, but he didn't like the feel of the rope. So he said he didn't want to wear it. And the gym teacher said, you have to because I won't know your name. And he said, well, I don't care if you don't know my name, I'll remind you. And the guy said, well, then the other